What's up, everybody? This is John from Coding Addict, and welcome to Axios tutorial video, where we'll cover an awesome HTTP library by the name of Axios, which makes data fetching a breeze and is a great alternative to good old fetch API. While we can use Axios in vanilla JS as well, in this project, we'll use it in the context of React. So my assumption is that you are quite comfortable with React library. So things like use effect, use state, and all that. If you need a refresher, I have an entire tutorial on React, and I'll leave the link in the description. In order to follow along, you will need a starter project, and you can find it in my GitHub. Just look for this repo, Axios tutorial React. And once you get here, just pick whichever option you prefer. In my case, I'm going to go with download option. Then I'm going to navigate back to my desktop. I'll set it up over here, and I'll probably rename it. I'm just going to go with Axios. I want to open up my text editor, which is Visual Studio Code. And then it's my preference to always set it up side by side. So I'll set up the text editor and browser side by side. Now, this is a straight up React project. Basically, I used create React app. I just added some boilerplate so we can save a little bit of time and focus only on the logic. And we want to go with npm install and npm start right away. And if you take a look at the source one, you'll find over here a components folder where there's only one, the title one, which you'll see in a second, and examples. So this is where we'll do all of our work. So we have first request all the way to interceptors. Again, there is already some boilerplate, so we don't have to waste our time on that. And you'll also find the final one. So this is a complete project if you ever need a reference. And effectively, the way we'll do our work, we have app.js, where at the moment, notice we just have the title, and we'll import the file, for example, first request, and we'll display the results on the screen, and then we'll slowly start setting up the logic over here. That is going to be the idea. And like I said, if you take a look at the final one, you'll find the examples. So the same folder, only in this case, it's a complete code. So this is a finished project. So if you want to run this, you can definitely do so, or you can just double check your code if you ever need a reference. And if your result is exactly the same, essentially, if you see Axios tutorial in the browser, we can start exploring Axios library. In the project root, you'll also find README with all of the steps we're going to take during the project. And the first thing I want to mention is the docs. So if you ever want to reference the official docs of the Axios library, here is the link. Then after that, we want to worry about the install. And if we're using vanilla JS project, then we can simply go with this script tag. But since in our case, we're using React project, we might as well go with npm instead. And the command you're looking for is npm install Axios. Now, I already added this particular library to the project, and you can definitely see that if you take a look at the package.json. But nonetheless, why don't we install it one more time together? Of course, this is up to you, but in my case, I'll showcase that, of course, we can use the command and everything going to work as expected. And I also want to go with npm start. Now I'll close the terminal. I don't think I'll need it anymore. As far as the first request, we want to import Axios, and then we just need to decide which HTTP method we want to use. So if we want to get resources from the server, we want to go with .get. So Axios, that is going to be the instance. And then we want to pass in the URL. And if we have different methods, then you can clearly see what is the method name. So for post, we're going to use Axios post. And in that case, of course, we'll need to provide more info as far as the method. It's not just going to be the URL, but we'll cover that a little bit later. So you just need to decide what functionality you want to perform as far as the server is concerned. So whether you want to get the resources, add the resources and all that. And depending on that, you'll choose a method. Now, if you don't provide the method after Axios, so the instance by default is going to be get. And in that case, we simply need to pass in the URL. So if you don't add .get explicitly, by default, it's always going to be get anyway. So we go with Axios, and then again, for the last time, we need to pass in the URL. Now, this does return a promise, and the data is going to be located in the data object. And when it comes to error, it's going to be located in the error.response. And essentially, our logic is going to look something like this, where we're going to use useEffect, and we'll pass in the function, in this case, fetch data. And I right away set it up as a sync, since this does return a promise. And I'll stick await in front of Axios. So we import Axios from Axios. Then we set up the function, and we'll stick await in front of the Axios. Notice here, I'm just going with default option. The get one, we pass in the URL, show the server we want to use, and then we'll wait for response. And after that, I'll log the response as well as the error, just so you have a better understanding. So now let's start setting this up, where I want to close the final and I want to go to app.js. And first, let's get the first request. So you want to import the first request from the examples, because in there, we already have the boilerplate code. We'll just need to add the functionality. Now, in my case, I'll right away call this a setup, and I won't change that name. So essentially, in the following videos, I'll just change the path. Keep in mind that all of them have been exported as default, so it doesn't really matter. So let's go here to examples, then first request, and then I want to render that right underneath title. And then in the console, we should see some dummy code, just so we can see that everything works. So in here, I have first Axios request. So now let's navigate here, and you'll notice the URL. Now this URL points to my server. So I purposely set the server up for my React course for Vanilla.js, just so we can practice data fetching. Now there is a limit. So if you'll see in a console a 429 response, you'll have to wait for 15 minutes and try again. And if you want to take a look at the other endpoints that are available, just navigate to Course API, and these are your options. And like I said, we're going to be using this one. And essentially, this just returns an array of products, and then each product is an object. So that should be our result. And effectively, we won't display anything on the screen. We just want to make sure that we get back the same result. So I want to showcase how we can fetch these products from this particular URL using Axios. So let's start working on that, where first we want to get the Axios. So right after the useEffect import, we want to go with Axios from, and then Axios library, which we just installed. And then we already have the useEffect. So now we just want to set up the function. I'm going to call this function fetch data, and it's going to be a sync right away. We won't pass any parameters in here, but we do want to set up try and catch. And again, this is not specific to Axios. We just need to keep in mind that this is a sync, and using try catch is a nice way how we can handle errors. Similarly, how we would use it with fetch. Again, this is not unique to Axios. So let's go right away with try and catch. And since we have a sync, we can just go with const and then response. And you know what? Let me close the sidebar. Go with the response here, then await, then Axios, and then for probably the 5th time or 6th time, or maybe the 10th time, we want to pass here the URL. That's the first argument that we always want to pass in. Then let's log right away response, just so we can see what happens. Right away also set up the error. And error will be located in this error object under the response property. So let me copy this sucker. Let's go with dot and then response. And then let's keep on moving. And instead of log, let's go with fetch data. Let's invoke. And at this point, it says response is not defined. Okay, so we have response here. Oh, my bad. It shouldn't be response and response. It should be error and then response. My bad. And now check it out. In the console, we have this giant object with lots of useful info. For example, we can get the status as well as status text. But what we're looking for is the data property. Essentially, every time the server will send something back, which in our case is that product array, it's going to be located in the data. So either you can destructure it here. So instead of going response, you can just set up the destructure and look for data. Or of course, we can assign a new value. So in the following examples, we'll most likely take a look at the data option as well directly here. But in this case, let's just go with data, and that is equal to response and then data again. Of course, you can also use these properties as well if you ever have a use case. So let's go here with log now. And if we log the data, we should see that entire array. And there it is. Now, of course, we have all of the product. Now, when it comes to response, what's really, really neat is the fact that Axios actually treats all of the errors like the errors, unlike the fetch. Because if you remember, when it comes to fetch, it only treats the network errors as errors. And in order to showcase that, let's go here. We have the URL, and now let me mess this one up. And now check it out. Actually, in the console, I right away have the 404, which means that we're not successful. And we also have this object, like I said. And again, data will be located over here in the data property. So if you want to specifically look for the message that is coming from the server, go with error dot and response and data. Now, if you're just going to go with error dot response, you'll see this entire thing. And again, what's really, really cool that it treats, for example, 404 as an error, which just makes things easier because fetch doesn't do that. So that is going to be standard setup for the GET request in Axios, where again, we import Axios, we provide the URL, it returns a promise, so we stick a wait in front of it. Most likely, you will set this one up right away as async, but technically, remember, you can still use then if you ever want to. We want to invoke that function in useEffect, and if we're successful, if we get this data back, of course, we can do whatever functionality we need to do. So, for example, if there would be a state variable by the name of product, we can set those products equal to this array, then maybe render them in the component. And hopefully you see where I'm going with this. And when it comes to error, the data is going to be located in error response data. But if you want to see the entire error, maybe you're looking for the status text, then you want to go with error dot and response. Okay, hopefully we're clear on the straight up GET request. But what if we need to provide more options? For example, a request headers come to mind. And for that, we'll need to pass in additional argument, and we'll set it up as an object. Now, if you're using straight up GET request, then this is going to be second argument. However, if you're using one of the methods where actually we're passing in data to the server, for example, post, then this is going to be a third argument. And in our upcoming example, I picked the API that is looking for the header, and that is going to be that joke API. And essentially, we'll set up straight up GET request. So notice here, Axios, and then URL. However, the second argument will be an object. And in there, more specifically, we want to set up headers property. And after that, the API is looking for accept header, and we want to pass in this application JSON. Otherwise, the API is going to send back the text. And then we'll add a little bit of additional logic. So let me close the file. Also, let's navigate to app.js. And in this case, I'm not looking for the file first request. I want to get the headers one. So let me change the path. And we're looking for the second one. Again, I'll keep the same setup name. I don't want to change that one. And I also want to clean the console. Basically, at the moment, we just have a button here. And every time we click on a button, we log fetch a dad joke. And underneath the button, this is where eventually we'll display that joke. So let's navigate over there. Like I said, I'm using dad joke API, and this is the URL you want to use. And if you want to reference their docs, you can definitely do so. In my case, I want to skip that. And I just want to repeat that in order to get the dad joke, we also need to provide the accept header. And first, I just want to showcase what is going to happen if we don't do that. So I have a state variable by the name of joke. I also have a function. And as you can clearly see, the default value is this one. So now let's set up our fetch dad joke function where we get the joke from the API. So at the moment, every time we click on a button, we invoke on click, and then we have the log. So let's change that one around where we want to right away set up try and catch. Let's go with const, and then response is going to be equal to await Axios. Notice here, I already import that one, and let's just provide the URL. So in the initial setup, I'm not going to provide that header, the accept one. So let's log this one. And once we click, I said, we're not going to get our data in the JSON format. So let's add that additional argument. We'll set it up as an object. If we want to provide headers, the actual property name is headers. And then in here, this is an object. And then we pass in the accept header. We want to go with application and /JSON. And now what you'll notice, if we refresh and if we fetch in the data, you right away have the joke. We're going to get the ID, the joke, as well as the status. And just to showcase that we can the structure right away, I'm not going to look for response data. I'll right away say, hey, get me the data out. And then let's log this sucker, more specifically data joke. Again, let's try to repeat that one more time. And now, of course, I'm going to have the joke. So at this point, we want to set our state variable, the joke, equal to whatever we're getting back from the server. So let's run this. So set joke data dot joke. And then when it comes to error, simply log if there is any. So error and then response. And now the result is going to be following, where every time we'll click on a button, we'll actually fetch a random joke from the dad joke API, and we'll display the result over here. So that's how we can set up additional info to our request. More specifically, headers. We add an object as additional argument, and in there we look for headers property and whichever header you want to add. Okay, and now let's take a look at how we can send data to the server. And we do that with a post method, which references the HTTP post method. And in here, not only we want to pass in the URL, but actual data we want to send to the server. And additionally, if you need to add more info about the request, for example, authorization header comes to mind, then like I mentioned in the previous video, we'll pass this in as a third argument. Now with that said, in the following videos, we'll cover global instance, we'll cover custom instance, and we'll also cover interceptors. And if you use one of those approaches, most likely you can just bypass passing this directly in the request. Again, we'll cover those things in the following video, so you'll see what I'm talking about. Now, as far as our example, I already have the app.js open. And in here I have the setup, and I'm looking for the file number 3. So 3 post request, and I'm rendering it on the screen. Now, as far as the file, in here I have the form where I have 2 values, name and email. Now, both of them are set up as state values right away with use state. And I'm also right away importing the Axios instance. Then notice how I have handle submit right away, prevent the default. And also I just want to check whether I have the results. If you take a look at the inputs, I have the value and I also have the on change. Like I said, I already prepared this boilerplate so we can just focus on the Axios. So here's the main goal. I have the course API server, and on there I have the route by the name of Axios tutorial post. So this one you cannot test out in the browser because it's looking for the post request. More specifically, in the request, it's looking for name and email. Now, we're not going to save the user in a database or nothing like that, but if we provide both values, we'll get back successful response. However, if one of them is going to be missing, then we'll get back the error response. And that clearly is going to show us how we can send post request with Axios. And let's start simply by just making sure that we can see both of the values. So let me go to the input. I'll say john@gmail.com. And once I press on login, I see both values. Okay. So now we can start setting up our request where we want to go with try and catch. Let's set up the response right away. That one will be equal to await, then Axios, then post. And like I said, first we pass in the URL. So this is where we'll be sending that data. And then comma, and actual data we want to send. And I want to grab these state values. And I'm fully aware that we have a shorthand for this, but initially, let's just go with name equals to name and email equals to email, because I think it's going to be easier to understand in the beginning. Then let's log this sucker. So let's say here response, and I'm going to be looking for data right away. And the same goes for the error. So let's go with log error and then response. Let's save this. And now I want to navigate to the big browser because I want to showcase the network request. So let's navigate over here. Let's refresh. And we're going to go here with John and john@gmail.com. Let's press login. And now take a look at our request. So first of all, notice the request method is post. So now we're sending data to the server. And also we can take a look at the payload right away. So this is what we're sending. We have name, and that is equal to whatever we have in input. And the same goes for the email. Now, when it comes to response, since we provide both values in response, you'll see message user created. Again, we're not saving this in the database, but the general idea is going to be exactly the same, where this is the response you're going to get back. Now, most likely you'll also get the JSON web token, but again, that is besides the point. And then I have the user, name, John, email, and then also a full name, where I just add the dough. And then if you want to test this out, whether everything works, maybe you're like, okay, this is just a standard response that you're getting back. Let's go with Susan. And you'll notice that server, again, is looking at both of those values. And if they're provided, then again, we get back the user with this Susan dough. And now let's also test it out. What happens if we don't provide one of the values? So first, let me just shorten this up. Like I said, starting with ES6, we have this ability for the shorthand, like so. So name is equal to name, email is equal to email. And then I'll send a request without providing the name value. And yes, I'm fully aware that normally we're going to check this in the front end as well. But the main goal of this video is to showcase what type of error response we're going to get back. So let me remove here the name in the input. And now what you'll notice in the console is an error. So we have 400 bad requests. And also in the data, we'll have this message property with please provide both values. So that's how we can send post requests using Axios, where it returns a promise. So most likely we'll stick a wait in front of it, axios.post. So that's the method name. Then we pass in the URL and then the data we want to send to the server. Okay. And now let's take a look at how we can set up a global Axios instance. And what that means is that we can add some kind of functionality by default. So every time we'll make a request with Axios instance, that functionality will be added. Now, in the README, you'll find quite a few options, but in our example, we'll just use the first one where we'll add the accept header and we'll set it equal to application JSON. And again, the idea is that every request which is going to leave our application by default will have that accept header. And we'll also in the next video take a look at the downside and how we can fix that using the custom instance. And in there, we'll cover the base URL, which again, you can also set it up on the global one as well. And our starting point is going to be following, where we want to navigate to app.js. We want to change it around. In this case, it's going to be file number 4. And in here, we have two URLs. One is to my server, and the other one is actually going to a different server. It's going to random user URL, because again, there are some downsides if we use this global approach, and I definitely want to showcase them. So we have this file and we want to set up straight up get request with product URL. However, we want to add that functionality, the accept header, to our default global Axios instance. So first, let's create a file. So in the source, I'll create a new folder. I'll call this Axios. Let's create a file here. Let's say global.js. And here we want to import Axios from Axios. Then let's set up that header. So Axios defaults, then headers, then dot common. And we're looking for the accept one. So accept header. And we want to set it equal to application, then / and JSON. Let's save it. Now we want to import this file in the app.js or index.js, basically, when our application spins up. So let's say here, import. Now we're looking not for the Axios library, we're looking for Axios folder and then global.js. And now if we go to global instance, and if we just import Axios from Axios, again, this does not change as long as we have invoked that file. And as a quick side note, if we just import, we automatically invoke that file. So this logic will be set up right away. If in the global instance, we import this Axios, and if we set up the request, you'll see something interesting in the DevTools. So let me go here where I have the global instance. Let's right away set up the try and catch. I'm going to go with response 1. Since there's going to be 2 of them, we want to go with await Axios and product URL. So now I'm going to navigate the big screen because it's going to be easier to showcase. So I have in the console nothing since I'm not logging. Technically, we can log, of course, just so we can see that everything works. So let's go with response 1. And we're going to get back the data. Now that is not the important part. The important part is if we navigate to a network tab, and more specifically, if we take a look at this React store product, what you'll notice in the request header is this accept one. So any request you'll set up, you'll have this accept header added because we did set up that global instance. And again, you have tons of things that you can set it up over here, but we're only gonna cover the first one, and the second one we'll cover with the custom instance. And let me right away showcase the downside. So let me go back to the global instance, and now let's set up second response. So let's copy and paste. Let's say here response to. Not going to be product URL. It's going to be a random user URL. And keep in mind that these are two different servers. So one is my server, which maybe for some reason is looking for that header. And we have totally different server. And in the console, we will see still the response one. Again, that is not the important part. The important part is if we again take a look at the network tab, now we'll have two requests. So one is going to be to my server, React store products, and the second one will be to the random user API. But for both of them, if we'll take a look at the request headers, we will see this accept and application JSON, which in this case, you can make an argument is not a big deal, but we need to keep in mind that if we have something sensitive, like for example, JSON web token, we don't want to start just sending left and right. And this is something that we'll fix with a custom instance. Okay, so now we're familiar with global defaults, and we also cover the downsides. So what is a possible fix? Well, we can set up a custom instance where we create a new file, we import Axios, but instead of defaults, we go with create. Again, we pass in the object, and here we have multiple options. If we want, we can set up the base URL. So if you know that you'll be setting up multiple requests to the same server, you can add here the root URL and then the specific URL when you actually invoke this one. And don't worry, you'll see that in a second. And the same goes for headers. Instead of setting this up globally to all the requests made with Axios, we'll add this header, the accept one, and only when we invoke auth fetch, which is the name in this case, of course, you can name it however you'd like, only then we'll add that. And as always, I think the example is going to be the best helper. So let's first navigate to app.js. And yes, I purposely set up a new file for the example, even though the most logic is going to be exactly the same, just so you have a reference for the global setup as well. So first, we're looking for custom instance. Then we won't use this anymore, so we can just remove it. Let's save it. Now we have custom instance, and this is exactly what we should see over here as well. So now let's navigate to the Axios. We want to create a new one. And in this case, I'm going to go with custom.js. Then let's import the Axios from, and we're looking for Axios. Here, let's create that instance. So in my case, I'll call this auth fetch. So let's say here create. We want to pass in the object. And like I said, I want to set up the base URL. So if I take a look at the custom instance, you'll notice that I don't have anymore here this URL, the one that leads to my server. But if I take a look at the global instance, notice this HTTPS and then Course API and React store product. So in this type of scenario, normally you can just take the root URL. In this case, that is Course API. In some cases, it's going to be longer. We can add this one to the custom instance. And then every time we make a request, we just need to say, well, what is the exact path? In this case, that's going to be / and React store product. So let me navigate back, base URL. And yes, as a side note, you can set this one up in default as well, like I said in the previous video. Then, just so I don't make some dumb typo, let me take the first part. Now, it's up to you. If you want, you can take the / and then you just need to provide the React store product in this case. But I actually prefer getting everything up to the / Just makes a little bit more sense if I provide the / when I invoke the instance. Like I said, that is totally up to you. This is going to be my base URL. Then let's add those headers right away as well. So let's set up the accept, and we're going to go with application / JSON. Now we do want to export this. So export default, and we're looking for auth fetch. And now let's navigate to the file. I want to go to custom instance. So I still have this random user URL, and above it, we want to import that custom instance as well as Axios instance. So for the random user, the one that's going to some different server, we'll just use the default Axios instance. However, for my one, we'll use that auth fetch because that one has some goodies. So let's say here, import auth fetch. And this is coming from the custom one. And also, let's set up the import and Axios from and just simple Axios. So when we set up the fetch data, first we want to go with try catch, just like we normally would. Then let's go with response one. And this one will be equal to await and then auth fetch. And remember, we already have the base URL. So like I said, the / part is up to you, but in my case, I prefer setting this up without the /. I'm talking about the base URL right now. So when I'm setting up the instance, when I'm invoking it, then I just add that /. It just makes a little bit more sense to me, but you don't have to do that. So React store product, so that will be the URL. And then the second one, const, and then response to. And in this case, I'm not going to log it. I don't see the point. Again, the main point is what we have in the requests, not whether we are getting the results or not. So await Axios, and now let's go with that random user URL. And if we'll take a look at the browser, let's refresh again. We have 2 requests going out. But if we'll take a look at the first one, we will see that application JSON. And notice again how we were successful, even though we did not provide the entire URL because we already have the base one. And if we'll take a look at the other one, the other request, we'll have actually here default accept one with text plain as well. And this clearly showcases the fact that with a custom one, we can pick whatever stuff we want to add to our request. So now every time we'll use this auth fetch instance, we'll have this base URL and whatever default setup we add over here. But then if we'll just use the normal Axios instance, it's just going to be a standard request. And as you can see, this is totally up to you. More specifically, depends on your application. If you have a setup where you can just add everything as a global instance, so if you don't have anything that possibly might be a security issue, then you can just add those things to a global instance and you're good to go. However, if you have a situation where you need more detailed setup, where effectively you want to add this only to specific requests, then of course custom instance makes a little bit more sense. Beautiful. And our last topic is going to be interceptors, which are functions that Axios calls for every request. And we can use them to transform the request before it leaves the application, as well as add some custom logic when we handle the response. In general, interceptors make way more sense if you have complex application. For example, authentication comes to mind. So we'll come back to them once there's actual need in our project. This is just introduction to interceptors. So in our examples, we'll mostly just log stuff. Also, we will set up interceptors on our custom instance, but please keep in mind, we can add them exactly the same to our global instance instead. And like I said, basically they are just functions. We go with custom instance in this case, then interceptors, and then either request or the response. So this is the outgoing request, and then the incoming response. Then that use, and then we pass in 2 functions. So in the case of request, in the first function, we access the request, the outgoing request, And we must return this request. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And as an example, we can add the header here. Notice the syntax is very similar to the default one. We just don't use defaults. We go with request, whatever is the parameter name. As always, you can call this Mamba Juice, then headers, then common. And in this case, we're just adding the accept header. But yes, you can add authorization header and all kinds of things. And like I said, in our case, we'll just log, just so we can see that it actually works. Then if we have error, we will have return promise reject error. And the same goes for the response one, where in here, we'll log the response that we successfully got the response back. We need to return this, and we also have the error one. And I'll talk about this one once we actually set up the code, because this is the place where we can make some global app decisions that affect all of our requests. And you'll see how cool is that. So first, let me showcase that in the app.js, I have setup, I have 6 interceptors file. And there's not much there. Again, I have the URL back to my own server, and we'll just be looking for the custom instance that we'll set up in a second. And then we just want to invoke it. And then you'll see the logs in the console. You'll also see the header. And we'll also take a look at how we can add some logic based on the error that we're getting back. And actually, we want to start here in the Axios. We want to go with new file, and we'll say Interceptors. Hopefully, I'm spelling this correctly. And we still want to get the Axios and all that. And you know what? I think it's going to be better if we just take this entire thing. I think it's going to be faster. Again, like I keep saying, you can set this one up on the global instance instead. I'm just using this example. So I have this auth fetch. Let me take this one out. So I'll leave this base URL in place. Then we want to go with our first interceptor. So let's just set up here auth fetch, then interceptors dot, and then I'm going to go with request use. And for time being, let's just pass in 2 empty functions, because I do want to copy and paste this to save a little bit of time. So let's set up over here the second function. Let's copy and paste, and it's not going to be request. This will be the response, like so. Then in the first function, we want to access the request that's going out. And again, it is, at the end of the day, of course, the parameter. So we can set up here whatever we want. So in my case, I'm going to go with request. Then in the function body, right away, let's return that request, because it's very easy to forget that, and the functionality is not going to work. So we set up the request. And in here, I just want to add that accept header, just so we can see. And also, I want to log this. I want to say request sent. And right above it, let's go with request, then dot headers dot common, then the name of the header, which in this case is going to be accept, and let's set it equal to, and I'm just going to go with application JSON. Now I can see that I have a tiny bug here. There is no dot, it's just accept. So that should do it. Then we also want to deal with error, and we want to go with return promise dot reject, promise dot, and then reject, and let's pass in the error. And now let's work on the response one. Now, as far as the successful response, let's just log that. So let's say here response, and again we want to return that. So return and response, and let's just say that it happened. So log and got response. And we also have the case for the error. So let's say if we send the request and we get back the error response, whether that's 400, whether that's 401, which is authorization error, or it's 404, means couldn't find the resource. And for now, let's just go with error and then log error response. And then, like I said, we'll add a little bit more custom code just so we can see how everything works. So error and response. Let's save this. Now we want to navigate to the interceptors. We want to get that custom instance from the interceptors in this case though. So let me open up this file. And in here, we already have the URL. Okay, that's good. Let's go with auth fetch. We're looking for Axios and then interceptors. We have fetch data in place. And instead of log, let's set up the try catch. And then we're going to go with const and then response equal to await, then auth fetch. So auth fetch. Remember, we already have the base URL, so we just go with React store hyphen and then product. And once we save, we'll have in the console request sent and got response, which means that now in here we can add whatever custom logic we want. And if you don't believe me, we can navigate, of course, to the browser. I can refresh, and you'll see that again in the headers, there's going to be that except one. And again, this is just an example. Of course, we can add whatever headers we want over there or some other logic for that matter. Now, where this is going to be really handy is when we are dealing with authentication, because we need to keep in mind that this gives us an option to set up code for the entire application. So for example, if we're getting some type of response, again, for the authentication, that would be 401. We can log out the user in all of the requests. So we basically don't need to repeat ourselves. You can think of it this way. So first, let me just go here to the interceptors and let me mess up the URL. So instead of React store product, let me add one more S. So we'll still get the logs and all that. Okay, that's good. The request is still sent, but now we're getting back the response. So route does not exist. So this is our data. And notice the status over here. So we have 404. So here's what we can do. We can mimic some global response that we would have in the case of 401. In this case, however, we'll work with 404. So I'll keep the error response, but I'll say if error dot then response then dot status. And if it is equal to 404 in this case, then let's just set up some kind of log. And we'll say do something. Now in our case, again, that something is just going to be a log, but normally this is where you would communicate with your application state. And we'll say log here. And in the log, let's just write not found. And then below this if one, let's just go with return. And then promise, and then reject. So we can still get that error in our instance. So over here, where we have the catch. But the idea right now is that, let's say for all the requests that we will set up, if the response is going to be 404, then we'll have this not found. Again, normally what's going to happen, you'll have 401, and then let's say you'll log out the user, which is, by the way, something that we do in my Marin course. So let's refresh here and now check it out. Since the response is 404, in here we have this custom logic that has this not found. So that's how we can set up interceptors in Axios.